Thanks, Prof.
Good morning. Bonjour to everyone in Canada and outside Canada. I'm Cheikh Tidiane Bangoura, President of Africa Study Group of the Canadian International Council here in Ottawa. And it's a real pleasure to welcome you to our new webinar. This webinar is in partnership with the Middle East Institute, a Washington-based institution. I would like to acknowledge that the Africa Study Group is hosting this meeting from the traditional unceded Algonquin and Anishinaabe territory. As part of our series of debates on security and governance in Africa, our last session in 2021 was devoted to the impact of violent extremism and terrorism in Africa. We then considered that the fact, according to the 2019 Global Terrorism Index, we considered the fact that 10 of the top 20 countries most victimized by terrorism were in Africa. Once again, we thank our audience for the great feedback and comments. I really appreciate it. In the same framework of discussion of security and governance in Africa, we are today talking about Sahel and Libya. As a facilitator, I am honored to introduce our three speakers who will share their views with us. I will start with Mr. Jonathan Weiner, who has been the United States Special Envoy for Libya, responsible for developing, coordinating, and implementing US policy in Libya. He was previously US Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for International Law Enforcement and served as the first General Secretary of the Global Forum on Corruption. Jonathan Weiner also served for 10 years as consul to US Senator John Kerry, as well as a regulator attorney specializing in national security law and cross-border regulation. It's important to mention that he has written and lectured widely on national security and foreign policy, human rights, international money laundering, sanctions, corruption, and the legal implication of globalization. And in 2016, he received the highest award granted by the Secretary of State for extraordinary service to the US government. I would like to welcome you, sir.
Thank you.
I will introduce also the other panelists before I let you speak. I will also introduce Mrs. Intisar Fakir. Mrs. Intisar Fakir est chargée de recherche et directrice du programme Afrique du Nord et Sahel du Middle East Institute, une institution basée à Washington. Elle est spécialiste de l'Afrique du Nord, du Sahel et des questions thématiques régionales clés, notamment la gouvernance, le changement social, la migration et la sécurité. Elle est l'auteur de nombreux rapports et articles et a consulté et conseillé des gouvernements et des entreprises aux États-Unis et en Europe sur les questions de développement du Maghreb et du Sahel. Elle parle couramment l'anglais, l'arabe et le français et est titulaire d'un MA de l'Idiot School de l'Université George Washington aux États-Unis. Notre troisième intervenant aujourd'hui sera M. Rida Yamouri. Il va nous joindre sous peu, s'il ne l'a pas encore fait. Il est chargé de recherche au Policy Center pour le New South et expert en géopolitique et relations internationales dans le Sahel ouest. Il a travaillé pendant une dizaine d'années dans plusieurs organisations et prodigué des conseils et à de nombreux gouvernements et parties prenantes dans les domaines du développement international, la sécurité, de la lutte contre l'extrémisme violent et le terrorisme, de la prévention des conflits, de l'accès humanitaire et de la migration. Rida a fait des présentations aux États-Unis, en Europe et en Afrique et a contribué à plus de 200 rapports analytiques approfondis sur les défis de la question que nous devons discuter aujourd'hui. Il est titulaire d'un master en politique publique et sécurité nationale de l'école de politique du gouvernement et d'affaires internationales de l'université George Mason. That's all for the presentation. And I should maybe add that our session will last 90 minutes, and each panelist will give a 15 minutes presentation. The individual presentation will be followed by a question and answer session for the remainder of the allotted time, approximately 30 minutes. The session is bilingual in the sense that participants have the opportunity to send their question in French and in English. And I will, of course, translate, if necessary, the question to the panelists. Without any further delay, I will turn the floor over to our first speaker, who is Nathan.
Thank you very much for your kind introduction and for putting this event together. To think about Libya in the context of cross-border issues is tremendously important. Let's just start with Libya's location because it is a keystone for the Sahel, for the Mediterranean, North and South Mediterranean, West and East Mediterranean. It connects all the way up into Europe, all the way extended through the Middle East. And so the connectivity provided by Libya, for good or for bad, is absolutely profound. Thus, when things fall apart in Libya, it's not great for the Sahel. It's not really good for Europe. It's not really good for the Middle East. So thinking about it as a cross-border problem is, I think, fundamental to also recognizing what part of the struggle in Libya is about, which is you've got people from all of those countries using Libya, again, for good or for bad. So Algeria, what's Algeria's interest in Libya? It's got a massive border with Libya, and it had a massive cross-border terrorist problem in which people would come into Libya, train, and then carry out attacks on tourists, in particular in Algeria, creating an immediate impact on Algerian security. Tunisia, it's been jobs, in particular. Egypt, it's been, again, cross-border security issues, threat of terrorism, and it's also been jobs in good periods and threats in bad periods. For the people of the Sahel, the question always has been, is Libya, who is a Libyan, who is not a Libyan? Is Libya a crossing point or a country that includes people from the Sahel? The Southerners in Libya have often been treated as second-class citizens and not included as recipients of Libya's wealth. It's been dominated by Libya's coastal regions. So the relationship between coastal Libyans and sub-Saharan Libyans has been a difficult one, recurrently, over a very long period of time. Many people have not traditionally had to respect borders or care about borders, and the borders have tended to be as much city-based borders as national borders in a lot of different contexts. So the past 10 years has illustrated a lot of the consequences of that, and that is that you have had Migrant movements in which migrants have been attracted to Libya as a jumping off point for more affluent areas have been abused, mistreated, enslaved, lost their lives in the course of the passage, not protected, taken advantage of. You've had terrorists come into Libya and establish training camps and a presence in Libya, which in turn has threatened urban areas in Libya, out of rural areas. They've trained in rural and come into urban and taken over, destroying the city of Sirte in the central coastal area. In particular, when the Islamic State took over almost 1/3 of the coastal region of Libya for the period of 2015-2016. So what happens within Libya matters to Egypt, it matters to Algeria, it matters to Tunisia. It has an impact on conditions in Chad, it has an impact on conditions in Niger, it has an impact on conditions in Sudan, on Mali, and on Mali. Can Libya be a source of solutions as well as source of problems? Absolutely. Libya's oil wealth under Gaddafi provided an economic foundation for jobs that went much more broadly than just affecting Libyans, which has a relatively small population by comparison to a lot of its neighbors. A stable Libya provides opportunities for development and growth, and unstable Libya provides ungoverned space where every bad thing can happen. Now, after the Libya uprising took place in 2011, there was a belief, pretty widespread, in the United States, in Western Europe, in the UN Security Council, amongst Libya's neighbors, that Libya's wealth would pull it through, and that as a wealthy country, Libya should be able to fashion post-Gaddafi governance. That turned out not to be true because in the absence of Gaddafi as an engine for making decisions in the country broke down into a variety of competitions with no clear adjudicator. And the various constituencies sought foreign support to bolster their own internal opposition, and you wound up for a period of time with Qatar and Turkey supporting so-called Islamist groups, many of them of whom had been the have-nots under Gaddafi. You had Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and the United Arab Emirates supporting the so-called Gaddafiotes, which were merely really the people who had been winners under the Gaddafi era. Both of these were overly inclusive phenomenon and labels. And you had good guy and good gal development programs funded by the European Union, by Turkey, by France, by the UK, by Germany, by the United States, by Spain, and others, Canada, come in and say, let's try and help you, Libya, with public financial administration so that you have more transparent spending of these government resources and you can reduce waste, fraud, abuse, and corruption. And you had a border security program designed to create some border security funded by the EU. And what did the European Union Border Security Mission found? It found that people were recording their entry and their exit into Libya on pieces of paper, on little logs at border crossing stations. You fill it in by hand. And there was no computerized system of any kind. And nobody in Libya seemed particularly interested at that point in creating one. So to the extent there was border security, it was a 19th century or early first half of the 20th century kind of system, not one that had been modernized one iota. So there was not meaningful border security, but there were push-pull factors. And so that's what the European Commission discovered. Were they able to do anything about it? Nothing, because the Libyans were too busy fighting for control, power, legitimacy, authority to actually participate in making that happen. Didn't care enough. What about creating a national security force, a national army? Well, the Turks tried that, and the Brits tried that, and the Italians tried that, and the Americans tried that, each in their national way, to do it in a way that was not about Turkey or the United States or the UK or Italy, but about Libya. Didn't matter who tried doing it, they all failed. Everybody failed. The Libyans were, again, not really interested in moving beyond city-state and localized security arrangements, dependent on local power centers, militias, warlords, whatever you might want to call them. So that failed. The French said, we're not going to be so ambitious. We're not going to try and train an army. We're going to try and train police. The French had a plan to train 30,000 police. I think it was 33,000. I think they told me they trained 33. That is not 33,000, not 3,300, not 330, but 33. It was that much of a failure. No one succeeded with any of their ambitious efforts to try and help Libya. So it's commonly said that after the uprising, the rest of the world forgot about Libya and failed to take care of it. Actually, it's not what really happened. The rest of the world said Libyans are capable of governing themselves. We're there to try and help with assistance. And that proved not to work out, because rather than developing autonomous self-government, Libyans for a period of time fought amongst themselves and tried to use foreigners as leverage for their efforts. Now, what did that mean for the Sahel? What did that mean for their neighbors? It meant essentially ungoverned space and a free-for-all in which almost anything could happen. So we had reports of terrorist groups coming in from Mali, from Algeria, from Chad, from Niger. We had weapons coming in from Sudan, paid for by Russia, paid for by Gulf states, depending. By the way, competing Gulf states, reports of Qatar funding it, reports of Emirates funding it from old Russian stockpiles. So everyone took their national agendas and imposed them on Libya, and Libyans took advantage of that which was being offered when they wanted to, when it was useful to them, and not when they didn't. So fast forward, it's now 2022. It's no longer 2012. What's it looking like now? Well, after 10 years of lots of failed efforts, we're seeing, even though there's right now contested prime ministers in Libya, reflecting the third period of contested government they've had since the uprising, the first being in 2013, 14, 15, the second being 2017 to 2021, the third one's just started up. While they're still struggling, what we're beginning to see is a Libya that's saying the Libyans are going to think about Libya first, and to heck with those foreigners. We'll figure out what the foreigners' issues are later. We're going to try and determine our own fate. And that's a positive thing. But is Libya ready yet to be a positive example that enables it to bring together people of the region in positive and constructive ways? Clearly not yet. Now, Algeria, which has been comparatively a lot more stable, or Tunisia, which has been comparatively less unstable, haven't really been able to do it either. Tunis is a nice place to have meetings, but multilateral activities aren't really driven by a Tunisian government, which is preoccupied by its own needs. Algeria has had its own issues currently, including not a great deal of extra space in recent years to be doing multilateral activities, despite its multilateral counterterrorism center, which has never really gotten off the ground. So to me, it's a region that is underdeveloped in terms of regional cooperation mechanisms to stabilize the whole region in common against cross-border threats. I'm going to conclude in a minute with this last example. When I was Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for International Law Enforcement way back in the 90s, we created international law enforcement academies, first in Budapest, then in Bangkok, then in Gaborone for Southern Africa, then one in El Salvador for Latin America. And the idea was bring people from a variety of countries together in a region to get to know one another and to build common approaches to solve common problems. That was the basic idea. Secretary of State Blinken, back when he was Deputy Secretary of State, wanted to do the same kind of thing, not necessarily in the law enforcement area, that just happened to be my space back when, for the Maghreb, or for the Maghreb and the Sahel. Never got off the ground in the last years of the Obama administration because there wasn't time. It was just beginning to form. And the problem, of course, is that Morocco and Algeria fighting with one another all the time over the Sahara really was an inhibitor. And so the question becomes, what kind of regional, multilateral cooperation mechanisms can be developed? They're going to help the whole region develop solutions, processes, and substance in common that allows for in-common operational activities. I want to take it beyond the short-term political to that structural question, which to me is such an important one. And that's true for public health. It's true for security. It's true for dealing with population ebbs and flows. It's true for dealing with smuggling activities. It's true for dealing with jobs. I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jonathan, for this excellent and profound analysis. I took from your presentation, there are so many things there, but I essentially took from your presentation that since 2011, the crisis in the Sahel and in the Libya region has deepened in the face of multiple national, regional, and international interventions. And despite the many international strategies and perspectives, the political process in Libya is still in what we call état de léthargie, and the country remains far away from a solution. I will let the participant ask their question. We have already 3 very important questions, and I will direct those questions to you after the presentation of the 2 other panelists. Thank you so much, and I would like especially to thank you for your presence and accepting our invitation. Intissa, Mrs. Fakir.
Hi, thank you very much.
Je vous laisse la parole.
Okay, thank you very much for having me. I'm going to present in English just to, I think, might be easier for everybody, but
go ahead,
yeah,
please.
I wanted to, I think what I kind of want to start with is engage a little bit with the central question as sort of a way to kind of frame the conversation a little bit, whether Libyan stability is a prerequisite for stability in the Sahel. And, I agree with everything that Jonathan has said. And in fact, I will kind of, echo a lot of the comments that he has made on Libya. We have come to see how instability in Libya has compounded instability in the Sahel. But I think it's also important to understand the terms under which stability in Libya could be good for the Sahel moving forward. And I think a lot of that will depend on how the Libyan conflict plays out, of course, who's going to take control of key institutions, and whoever those actors are they going to be willing to work with regional partners? What are their regional priorities? And how do they view stability in the Sahel? Is this something that they could view as beneficial to them or not? But the point I want to make, and this is what I'll focus on more, is that beyond Libya itself, this question also applies to other actors in the region too, right? And this is what I'll look at a little bit more closely. The regional role that each of the 3 key actors here, Morocco, Algeria, and Libya, have played following the collapse of the Gaddafi regime. And so just kind of with this sort of framing of the broad dynamic, I think it's worth understanding a little bit some of the background of each one of these countries and where we are now in terms of how everybody is engaging on Sahel issues. So on Libya, it's a bit tricky, of course, to talk about Gaddafi as a stabilizing force, but once his regime collapsed, and here I'm in complete agreement with everything that Jonathan said, the political and security vacuum allowed these illicit networks and terrorist organizations to operate freely, right? The actors that had come together to essentially force Gaddafi out began fighting each other. The division and the absence of a single central power really provided opportunities for militias and armed groups, including violent extremists, to gain greater foothold in the country and to expand into the Sahel. The Sahel, of course, had already been grappling with issues at the heart of citizen trust in governments, including corruption, poverty, economic vulnerability, food insecurity, social conflict, and of course, insufficient or completely absent basic public services. So in the years after Gaddafi's fall, we've seen an increase in weapons smuggling and migrant smuggling, which feeds into this relationship across border between smugglers and violent extremist group that had existed before. In terms of weapons smuggling, Gaddafi had one of the largest weapons stockpiles in Africa. from advanced assault rifles, heavy weapons, communication systems, all of which really ended up falling under rebel controls after his fall. And after 2012, thousands of weapons were released from abandoned warehouses, which ultimately fell in the arms of illicit groups. Again, smugglers, militias, terrorist organizations. Libya also had one of the world's highest rates of civilian gun ownership prior to 2011, which contributed to this mass distribution of weapons throughout the country and into the greater Sahel region. Other types of trafficking also became widespread. Drugs, fuel smuggling, the same smuggling networks are also involved in human trafficking and migration, which becomes even more widespread across the region after 2015. This was sort of the peak of irregular migration in the region at sea and land border. And of course, this continues to be a major concern for Europe, particularly, and it shapes the way that it helps shape at least the way that European actors engage in the conflict. Again, another element that Jonathan mentioned, which is the economic element that Libya provided here, and how the loss of income from migrant workers in Libya impacted Sahelian countries. The IOM estimated that Libya had something like 2.5 million migrant workers prior to 2011. There was, of course, the issue of these migrants losing their income and having to return to their countries post conflict, and seeking different sources of income. So this is a little bit the picture in the kind of past Gaddafi years, and I think a lot of that remains the issue as of now. But one of the key outcomes here that I will highlight is that the fall of the Gaddafi regime sort of created a little bit of opportunity for Morocco and Algeria to play a stronger role, and potentially a different role in the region that they had played before. As Jonathan said, none of them was able to completely fill that vacuum, but we saw a little bit of sort of of engagement on each one of their sides. So Algeria had until very recently wanted to maintain a limited role in the Sahel. The focus had been on leading mediation efforts in Mali in the 90s, early 90s, mid 90s, again in mid 2000s, and also in 2012 and 2013. This engagement was also, I think, driven by domestic considerations to limit any such unrest within Algeria's own Tuareg population. This sort of engagement was also in keeping with Algeria's non-interference policy, if we can call it that, but it also reflects, as we heard earlier, the focus on domestic politics with the uncertainty of then President Bouteflika's health and the whole succession debate that was dominating in these years. But I would say that this posture has sort of been changing recently, especially with President Tebboune, and more importantly, with the military establishment really looking to play a stronger foreign policy role in the region and to re-emphasize their strength and their power domestically and abroad. And some of the indications that we can kind of use for this is the constitutional amendment that Algeria adopted in November 2021, which empowers the president to order army deployment beyond Algeria's border. I think this is one of the signs that we could see Algeria looking at a more active military engagement, either at the bilateral level, but also potentially as part of peacekeeping missions and so forth. So I think this is an interesting thing to look at moving forward. Institutionally, also some of the signs that I'm at least kind of taking as a way to observe what's happening within Algerian foreign policy establishment. The leadership brought back Ramtan Lamamra as foreign minister and sort of has reorganized the diplomatic corps to better support him. He has a long history with the African Union, with European actors and with US partners as well. In terms of specific issues, Lamamra has offered to mediate on the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam issue between Egypt, Sudan, and Ethiopia, using, again, his knowledge and influence within the African Union. Algeria has also sought to play some sort of mediation role on and off in Libya, The other area where Algeria is looking to reassert its influence, of course, is within the African Union. And we saw this maybe more recently on the question of whether Israel can maintain observer status. And this fits in more broadly with in the Algerian bilateral tension with Morocco. And I'll talk about that a little bit in just a minute. But let me just kind of maybe give a few examples on the Morocco side of how Morocco has tried to take advantage of Gaddafi's absence to exert some influence in the Sahel. This role, of course, remains limited because Morocco does not have, Libya's resources or reach. But I think there are some areas where Morocco has been able to engage effectively, the military in terms of military cooperation and CVE space through training of religious leaders. And military support for the G5 Sahel has been limited to capacity building and training on border security, counterterrorism, transactional crime. Sub-Saharan African officers, including Sahelian officers, receive training in Morocco's military academies. In terms of the religious study programs, Morocco has been training imams on a more tolerant reading of Islam, expanding on some of the domestic efforts that they had carried out to address, domestic terrorism challenges. This is the Mohammed VI Institute for the Training of Imams in Rabat. It has trained hundreds of imams from West Africa and the Sahel. Morocco has also developed positive bilateral relationships with most Sahelian countries, Mali, Burkina Faso. Again, here beyond the security dimension, there are strong cultural connections, some economic cooperation and support. The Sahel and West Africa have specifically been important to Morocco's own foreign policy priorities to rebuild and boost ties with African countries in general, bilaterally, and through involvement in institutions like the African Union. We saw Morocco get back in 2016. And I would say here that the goals is not just limited to securing greater support from African nations on the Western Sahara issue, but it also helps with power projection and competition with Algeria. I think for Morocco, this has worked, especially on the latter, because this engagement has really proven alarming to Algeria, and it has kind of contributed to this Algerian desire to curb Moroccan influence, growing Moroccan influence, particularly now that Morocco has a normalized relationship with Israel, and there is a lot of concern in Algeria on that. So Algeria cut diplomatic relations with Morocco over the summer. Of course, again, as Jonathan mentioned, these are two actors that have a long history of antagonism, animosity, which has to do with the Western Sahara issue. And that's another element in this sort of complicated regional picture. But, to kind of wrap up here, I think it's important to keep an eye, of course, on the Libya crisis, how it evolves, and how do actors that emerge view Saheli instability, as I said at the outset. But likewise, there's also this sort of tension between Morocco and Algeria that will be interesting to watch. And I think this is where I depart from what Jonathan is saying. It's not just about, is there any kind of structural mechanism through which we can see better collaboration or any kind of collaboration really between Morocco and Algeria. My point here is, are we likely to see more competition between Morocco and Algeria play out in the Sahel, right? Algeria's views of Morocco's efforts in Western Africa and the Sahel will be important to determine. Will Algeria try to push back even further against Morocco's engagement to replace it with its own stronger action in the Sahel and with Sahel countries and forces? And for Morocco, can they maintain or increase this sort of multi-layered engagement that they have tried to create? Can they continue to invest in economic cooperation given domestic economic challenges? And what will be the next step in that effort, and how will Algeria react to it? So, these are important elements, I think, to consider in the debate about stability in the Sahel. In addition, of course, to other issues that we talk about, like the role of international actors, the EU, US, Russia now, and more important, even the domestic elements within each of these Sahelian countries that have laid some of the grounds for instability and insecurity. And I will just stop there.
Merci, Intissa. An excellent presentation. I try while taking note here to connect your both presentations, and I take from your presentation in connection with the presentation made by Jonathan, that first, historically, the security dynamics of the Maghreb and the Sahel are interconnected in various dimensions, and the crisis in Libya has devastating consequences for the Sahel and the neighboring countries. And in this connection, for all Sahel and neighboring countries, security in Libya has become an issue of domestic security policy and concern. The second point that I took from putting your two presentations together, and here I don't know if I have to say despite or regardless of the international strategy and perspectives of other external actors. It transpires from your presentation that the responses to the current security predicament will be local and will be locally and regionally negotiated by a number of actors, both states and non-states. The third point that I took from your both presentation is that, I hope I'm correct here, the military instrument alone will not bring about stability. Indeed, military action should only be a minor component of a larger political strategy. And in conclusion to your both presentation, I would say that what is clear is that the future of Maghreb and the Sahel countries will be the outcomes of their relations and will be co-constitutive. I will go to the next presentation. And I thank you very much for your profound presentation, Mr. Weiner and Intisar. I will go now to our next panelist, Rida, who will focus more on the Sahel Libya issue, taking into consideration what we have heard before from Jonathan and Intisar. Rida, vous avez la parole.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, and pleasure to be with everyone today and share my thoughts. While I focus on the Sahel, I'm going to try, but when I started working on the Sahel in 2011, I was also looking into Libya, and working on the Sahel, you cannot work on the Sahel without looking into Libya. Absolutely, the crisis in Libya in 2011 has accelerated the conflict and the issues that already existed in the Sahel. I would not say the Libyan conflict created the conflict in the Sahel, but just accelerated it, because when everyone who has been working on the Sahel prior to the Libyan conflict have seen what was developing in the region. There was a new rebellion already building up in Mali. The expansion of jihadist groups of AQIM back in the day in Algeria was already expanding in the Sahel, in northern Mali, in northern Niger. So all these factors were already taking place. So the Libyan conflict just contributed to it. And then started with the crisis in 2012 in Mali, which has led to the occupation of the north by jihadist groups, in addition to other non-state groups and more secular armed groups. So I'll just briefly provide the crisis, look at it, provide a summary between what happened 2012, and I can't believe it's been 10 years. And try to summarize it for you and give you an assessment of where we are today. And I'm sure you have been following what's been happening between France and its Sahelian allies, and and domestically as well, and with Russia. So I'll try to provide as much as possible and some of these insights to bring you up to speed of what's happening in the Sahel, which I totally agree that I think northern neighbors of the Sahel has a major role to play because of the relations, the economic, social, religious, all the relationships that they have. Because as Mr. Whiter mentioned earlier, the borders to these communities and those people don't exist. And they never considered us as a kind of separation between those countries. So they look at the region as one country. So to go back, and the crisis of 2012 instigated the multiple interventions that we have seen in the region, instigated the military intervention led by France in January 2013, followed by the peacekeeping mission, MINUSMA, one of the most expensive peacekeeping mission in the world, also the deadliest. And to the security, the military interventions has not achieved the results that everyone was hoping for. Yes, they have managed to chase jihadist groups from key towns, from certain areas. They managed to kill key leaders, but they have not managed to eradicate the region from jihadist groups. Instead, the situation where we are today is worse than it was 10 years ago. Jihadist groups expanded their areas of operations. We are seeing now transformation. Instead of moving north, they are moving south. So these were what started in northern Mali, northern Niger. Now they are in Burkina Faso, they are in Niger. We have seen now intensified activities in northern Benin, in northern Cote d'Ivoire, on the borders with Burkina Faso. So coastal states are also have seen intensified activities of jihadist groups. The question about weapons, yes, Libya in 2011, 2012 contributed to the conflict in the Sahel, but arms today and weapons that contributed to the conflict in the region mostly are coming from West Africa itself. They are coming from also ransacked military bases in those countries, in Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso, rather than coming from Libya or elsewhere. So the majority are coming from within, either in West Africa or within these countries themselves. The humanitarian crisis. Today we have, as of December 2021, we have more than 1.5 million internally displaced persons in Burkina Faso alone. Then without adding the Lake Chad Basin, without looking at Niger and Mali and Mauritania as well. So it's a very it's a worst humanitarian situation that we have seen historically in the region. The fourth, the political situation. Yes, Mali, Burkina Faso were repeatedly being praised by the West of like being, the democratic countries in the region. An example. Yet we've seen 2 coups d'etats in Mali within 2 years. Then last month we saw the coup d'etat in Burkina Faso. Why these coup d'etats happened and why we are seeing these tensions also with France. The ingredients are there and the signs are there. Why? Because as I mentioned, 10 years later, the situation is worse than it was in 2012. So everyone is getting frustrated by the results. There are no results, the situation continues to worse, and they're looking for alternatives. And sometimes those alternatives are not the best. And that's why we have seen uprisings in Mali that led to the first coup d'etat in August 2020, and then the second coup d'etat in May 21. And then we saw the last month in Burkina Faso, because the population, in addition to the militaries, are getting frustrated because they have not seen the support that they wanted to, so they could counter the rise of militancy. And also the population has continued to suffer from the deteriorated security situation. while we are focusing on jihadist groups, that they are also not the main contributor to violence and instability. We have seen increased civilian casualties because of inter-community tensions, and also the militaries of these countries also have contributed and carried acts of atrocities because of stigmatization of certain communities. These are just some examples to just contextualize why the situation today is worse than it was in 2012. And as I mentioned, these countries are looking for alternatives, and Mali clearly made a radical decision is to work with the Russians. The announcement they made in the September, and that of course kind of sort of the red line for the French, and that's why now French almost they cut their diplomatic ties with Mali. The French ambassador have been kicked out of Mali. I think they're supposed to make the announcement today or tomorrow, France, what they're going to do with the Barkhane military operation. Is it going to be relocated, or is it going to be totally withdrawn? Personally, I don't see it withdrawn. I think I see maybe some sort of reorganization and a reshaping of the forces. The peacekeeping mission MINUSMA in Mali, as I mentioned, like the most expensive and deadliest, they intervened to operate in northern Mali, and then a couple of years later they found themselves they have to work in central Mali, and the context that they walked into was already complex enough in 2013, and it just continued to get worse, and the peacekeeping mission is struggling to keep its own staff safe and its own peacekeepers safe before doing what's supposed to do, which is the protection of civilians. So a lot of challenges are facing that. So to the point of our conversation, I think Libya and the North African countries, I think stability in the north and the role of like the regional actors that could play, they could play a role, but I think it comes down to the states themselves. The Malian state, the Nigerian, the Burkinabe, I think they have to assume their responsibility when it comes to showing the results and showing the willingness to accept first there is a problem. The problem is beyond just jihadist groups, but also there are problems at the domestic local politics. There are issues of how the militaries are operating and how they are built and how they are being trained and how about their operations. And instead of just blaming the foreign and international actors. But again, also international actors are not they also have some responsibilities to claim. When we talk about stability, as Intisar mentioned, like when you ask locals about what stability means to them, it's not what stability means to the European Union or to the French or to the US. So there are some different interests there, and what is relevant to locals is not what is local, what is for the international community. So I think first we have to find this common ground and the strategies that are aligned with the local communities, with the local people and other countries in the region. And I am afraid similar mistakes are going to be made in coastal states, and that's why we are seeing the spread into to northern Benin, northern Cote d'Ivoire, and areas that share similar ingredients that have led to instability in the Sahel in the first place. Inequality, lack of public services, tensions, and really lack of trust between security forces and local communities, stigmatization of certain communities, self-defense and ethnic aligned militia groups that are only serving certain communities rather than serving the nation. So I think all those issues, hopefully we can learn from them that have led us to the situation where we are today in the Sahel and partially in Libya. and try to avoid them in other areas. So I will stop here and looking forward to the questions.
Merci, Rida. Je crois que vous êtes parti en profondeur sur certains aspects dont beaucoup de gens ne parlent pas. Thank you very much. And I like the way you try to connect your presentation to the two previous presentation. Thank you so much for that. I took from your presentation, the first point, I took 3 points. The first one is that despite considerable international effort, especially by African countries, the Sahel is still experiencing one of the longest crises in Africa, with irrefutable implication for global peace and security. The second point is that and I really appreciate this one, it transpired from your presentation that insistence on the academic division between the two sub-regions, North Africa, Maghreb, and Sub-Saharan African Sahel, obscures and abstracts the need to find multilateral responses to transnational problems and challenges that enhance the triangle in the relationship between the Sahel, the Maghreb, and Europe, which is somehow an aspect of global peace and security in this context. And the third point that I also took from your excellent presentation is that divisions among European countries, particularly France and Italy, as well as among African countries, specifically the G5 Sahel countries, have hampered effort to find a solution to the conflict. And these aspects, this perspective seems to be very important because it's not always visible through the different diplomatic discussion that we have on this issue of Sahel and on Libya. And I really appreciate that you mentioned it. The time was short for you to go into details, but I believe that we already have many questions, and then we will go to the question and answer period. The first question that I have here is coming from a retired US ambassador, from Mr. Herman Cohen. And he's asking, in Libya, is the Fezzan region a source of arms for the Islamist terrorists in the Sahel? I will not assign the question to any of you. I will ask all of you to decide who will answer to the question.
I mean, I can provide a not fully informed response, which is that it was not something which we saw much of during the time that I was working on Libya. Weapons were coming into Libya mostly, rather than leaving Libya. Libya's terrorist problem, which included people from the Levant, from Syria, and from Iraq, were part of the substantial part of the terrorist problem, in addition to indigenous AQIM. And there was some Boko Haram, which came up at one point. And so they may have obtained weapons from Libya, but I don't think it was a foundational element. Libya was mostly importing rather than exporting weapons for many of the years following the uprising, because Libyans were fighting with one another or preparing to. Now, that said, there was a massive amount of, as Intisar has discussed, there was a massive amount of weapons that were liberated from Gaddafi's arsenals. And those went to a wide range of people, and who could sell them to anyone for anything. But they might well be able to get more money locally than exporting them south. So it's a good question. I don't know the answer adequately. I do want to make one point that's related, because it was raised by Rita's presentation, which is the Russian presence in Africa. In a military sense, is a somewhat new or renewed phenomenon. And it wasn't just Mali, they did Central African Republic as well. And in both cases, France got very upset as a result of the local governments relying on Russian mercenaries who are in fact being directed by the Kremlin to engage. And that's also been true in Libya. And they played a negative role, from my perspective, in all three countries, not because it affects US interests directly, but because it's been bad for the countries and the country's cohesion and the country's ability to move, each of these countries' abilities to move ahead in a reasonable way with domestic reconciliation and domestic processes. It's given additional force to people who didn't then have to negotiate a compromise.
Yeah, if I might add to that question about the weapons, I think as I mentioned in my presentation, the weapons now reaching Islamist groups in Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, they are coming from within, from West Africa, from the bases that they have ransacked, including the Islamic State in West Africa province, like around the Lake Chad basin. When you see the videos they release and the pictures of the weapons that they have seized when they carry attacks against Nigerian or Burkinabe or Malian bases, I don't think they still depend on the weapons coming from Libya. They have not, I'm not saying that definitely that route has been closed, but the main weapons are coming, the majority of it come from these countries themselves. That's what I have been perceiving. And this also comes with the transformation of these groups. As I mentioned earlier, they were all connected to AQIM, which was in North Africa, but now they have their own branches in Central, in Mali and in the Lake Chad Basin. You have Jamaat Nusrat al-Islam wal Muslimin, which broke away from AQIM, so they have this more localized narrative rather than continue to be connected to North Africa. Same thing with Boko Haram and the Islamic State. They created their own local branches in different areas. So they continue to rely on that localized narrative.
Thank you so much. I move to the next question, which is in Libya, will Saif al-Salam be a unifier?
Short answer is no. It's not realistic for all kinds of reasons. There's, in addition to the human rights issues from the Gaddafi family's past, including his own, there are corruption issues that are massive. There are tilt issues in terms of haves toward have-nots and in terms of the people who took care of him during the period of time that he was either a prisoner or not. He could potentially have had a positive role in 2021 in calling for principles of reconciliation, unification, Libyans treating other Libyans with respect, political solutions being needed that would be democratic in nature, Libya taking advantage of its wealth to provide new opportunities for new generations. He could have had a messaging campaign that could have enabled him to be a unifier. He didn't really do that. He just kind of ran to be president, and I don't think that really helped put him into that unifier position. In the same way, some people would like to see the king restored. Kings have been out for what, 50 years now? A long time. But there are people who would like to see Libya be a kingdom again under its old constitution. I think it's sentimental, it's nostalgic. It seeks a restoration in some respects, but I don't believe it. I did think he had an opportunity to do something, but it would have been renouncing power, not grabbing it.
What about the Muslim Brotherhood, Jonathan? Are they in a position to play any kind of role in determining, in defining the future
Well,
leader?
I want to know. I want to know what the term Muslim Brotherhood means. Does it mean Turkish Muslim Brotherhood, the justice and construction type political party, where you have a party associated with the state, or does it mean Egyptian-style Muslim Brotherhood, where there was a risk of when they took over of there never being elections again? I don't know whether the term Muslim Brotherhood is the same in every country. I suspect it is not. I believe it is not. And there are different elements of it. The Libyans I've met who have been labeled at various times Muslim Brotherhood by other Libyans have a wide range of views. And the people who have expressly been part of the Muslim Brotherhood have by and large been a very distinct minority. That is not a big minority, but a small minority in terms of the number of seats that they get elected to in Libya's parliament. So it depends on what one means by the label. From my perspective, the various labels in Libya are mostly labels that people put on their opponents rather than labels that actually fit them. And there's an old expression of the categorical imperative in German philosophy, in which when you put a label on something, it inevitably misrepresents it. It captures certain things and misses other things. And my belief about Muslim Brotherhood in a Libya context is it misses more than it captures. What's going to be necessary for Libya to succeed is inclusive government of shared wealth, in which essentially every Libyan, including the Libyans in the far south, including Libyans who've never been taken care of adequately by the Libyan government, are included in solutions with satellite cities in the south being funded by the government to create essentially magnets for people who have had nomadic lifestyles over the centuries, to provide further foundations for education and healthcare, especially at a time of tremendously challenging environmental crisis and tremendously challenging health risk for the foreseeable future. So Libya, to be a safe country and a stable country, is going to need to invest more in its south for the peoples who cross the border as well as for the people who stay inside the border. If it's able to do that kind of a solution, that's not a Muslim Brotherhood solution, it's not a Gaddafiist solution, it's a solution that's organic, which addresses organic issues. So I'm, as an analyst, much more interested in what people actually are interested in doing locally, what their vision is nationally, what their vision is cross-border, and whether they can work well with others. This is what makes the current struggle over Libya so interesting, and that each of the two contenders for prime minister right now have got strengths in transcending a narrow base to reach out more broadly. One of them, Debeba, the current interim prime minister, who's been internationally recognized as a result of the UN process, has used Libya's wealth on infrastructure projects that transcend lots of space. That's a good thing. Has he done it through democratic processes? Not particularly. It's deals. Fadi Bashaga defended Tripoli against Haftar, and then General Haftar, and then found a way to bridge that divide together with Salih Issa, who's been trying to build a base in the east. So that potentially bridges east and west. Now in Libya, if you can bridge east and west and south, if you can get Turkey and Egypt together, if you can get the Qataris and the Emiratis together, if you can get Algeria and Morocco participating in the same solution sets, the same negotiations and discussions, if you can get the African Union functioning in a practical way beyond rhetoric to actually help deliver solutions, then Libya is becoming a stabilizing influence through that process for the broader region. I just gave a bunch of ifs, but none of those ifs are impossible ifs. They're all possibilities. I saw Algeria and Morocco both be constructive on Libya during my time and participate to some extent in one another's cooperation. Lamamra, foreign minister, who Intisar referred to earlier, very canny guy, very sophisticated diplomat, a lot of capacity, has the ability potentially to further create regional opportunity and action, which, as I've made clear, is what I believe is essential for the future. Now, it's not going to solve local governance problems. So my last point in response to this question, and I'll be quiet again, at least until the next question, is let's go from the big international that I've just talked about and the big regional and the big think and the common approach and the unified standards and procedures and integrative things, all of which are necessary, back to the local. The Gulf states were able to modernize by focusing almost as city-states on local capacity building. And in Libya, individual cities are likely building capacity faster than national capacity right now. And so the question of how you build capacity at a very local level for population centers with governments that function, which Rita referred to in the negative, that they weren't, that they were just doing a lot of competition with amongst one another rather than problem solving. You need that if you're going to then have that build out internationally and cross borders. So you actually need very, very local activity, and you need initiatives and ideas that transcend borders with people committed to common problem solving, because it's all in their, it's in everybody's interest. And that's why I called out Russia, because I don't see Russia doing it. I see Russia doing something very different, which is inviting disunion, picking winners, preventing solutions through the use of military forces that it controls and directs but pretends are private.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. I will move to the next questions. The three of you have been talking about the UN in your presentations. And we know that since 2011, we have seen so many UN Security Council resolutions, and most of them even adopted based on Chapter 7 with a very strong, I will say, wording of Chapter 7. And still, many people are saying that is not enough. And I would like to know what should be the UN political strategy in the quest to foster a human security approach towards the interconnected Sahel, Libya instability. You know that recently, that was last month, the UN mission was extended just for 3 months. Would that be a problem for stability?
The reason why it was extended for just 3 months is the Russians government objected to a longer extension. The reason Russia objected to a longer extension, in part, is it wants to control the selection of a special envoy. Because it wanted to do that, Guterres worked around Russia to appoint Stephanie Williams, the previous acting special envoy, a retired American diplomat, as a special advisor. Russia wants to retain sufficient control of the selection of the special envoy, in my opinion, in order to enable Russia to continue to maintain its military base in Libya and its other relationships, regardless of contrary UN Security Council resolutions. So it's part of this problem in Africa, and that Africa is very much in play now for Russia. There are initiatives driven by President Putin in Africa. Anybody can go online and look them up. There's lots of information available on it. And it is a mixture of political, economic, and security. I don't object to that as an American because it's Russia. I object to it only because it's being carried out in a way that I believe is generally not good for Africa.
Rita, maybe I will ask you the next question. You talk in your presentation about the different ethnicities that we have in the region, and also about the difference of position, political position, even between the G7 members. Is there a need to rethink international approach in the Sahel?
I don't know the answer. I think it's the problem is so deep and it's so old and still yet to be fixed. We continue to make it worse. As a matter of fact, when we talk about ethnicities, when you look at the history of internal conflicts in Mali, Niger, and in Burkina Faso as well, and other West African countries, not just the Sahel, what central governments does or do every time there are conflicts, they play in order to undermine those who are being opposed to the government, they align themselves with one ethnic group to counter the rise of the other group, because a lot of these groups are ethnically aligned. Like, for example, like Mali, when the Tuareg rebellion in the 1990s, they played the Tuareg communities between themselves, just between one tribe against another. They played the Arabs in northern Mali, one tribe against another. They now in central Mali in more recently, and they have done that again in 2014, 2015. And then in 2015-16, they have done the same thing in central Mali, playing the Dogon communities against the Fulanis. So instead of trying to resolve the issue and address the grievances among those who are demanding for better conditions, etc., we're not talking about jihadists, we're talking about groups who are just looking for better conditions. They try to counter that by dividing those communities, so putting one community against another. And that's why we are continuing to see these divisions among this within countries in the region. The international community, I don't think they can do anything about that, because it's more domestic. What they can do is to find mechanisms of justice and conflict mechanisms that existed for centuries, because tensions existed, but they were never as violent and as divided as they are today in the region. So certain mechanisms worked in the past. So they have to find what are just mechanisms that worked, and how we could adapt them and make them relevant today without coming up with new mechanisms, because you don't need to recreate the wheel, because that will just make the matter worse. So that's what I see the role of the international community is to provide that capacity building, to engage in that dialogue and discussions, rather than trying to continue to divide communities.
Thank you so much. There is a question. There are many questions. I will ask the panelists to feel free to read them and to take the opportunity to it. The next question, I will. It's a question to Jonathan and Rita, and I believe, Jonathan, here we will need your experience as the first General Secretary of the Global Forum on Corruption. And the question said, to what extent do you see the resource management and governance mismanagement in the Sahel and North Africa as responsible for the current mess in all sub-Saharan?
Yeah, all over corruption is a problem all over the world, and corruption is particularly problematic when in-groups represent minorities rather than majorities and need to reward their minority in order to stay in power, which is the phenomenon that Rita has just really described as playing out, which is you have to clutch a particular group because otherwise you're not going to have anything at all. You do that through rewarding cronies and people around it to the exclusion of others. And in the history of the United States, this was a recurrent phenomenon whenever a new ethnic group gained control of a city, having been previously excluded. And the particular ethnic origin of the group shifted over time depending on American history. But it was a recurrent problem. And eventually it created a tremendous amount of economic injury as people who had capital, money would then move out, would then leave because they were being essentially treated as, they were being treated to predatory activity. Corruption is unpopular in every country in the world. It's explicitly criticized in the world's great religions as a problem. And so the question becomes, what are the indigenous mechanisms by which universal standards can be applied to reduce the threat? And there you have to look at what are the sources of funds which are being abused, and how can you put controls on those sources of funds to make spending more transparent and more universal, more inclusive. And there's been a lot of literature on it, there's a lot of rules of governance on it, but it has to be applied by people because they decide in the end it's a better form of governance and they're more likely to be able to maintain power as it were, by taking care of a broader range of people. So there's a huge cultural element to it. And you see countries that think they've licked the corruption problem or overcome it, and then it comes back. And these include some of the most affluent countries in the world. The United States, when it's got people in power who are corrupt, can probably, or France, but two countries that have recurrent struggles with corruption, can probably afford it better than very poor countries. But this is a beast that is never vanquished. You can drive it back down into its hole, you can make it deprive it of food, but it requires it's a constant struggle by the individual societies. And then the one thing you can think about is the cross-border resource flows and how other countries can help combat corruption by making it harder for cross-border economics, push-pull factors to affect domestic corruption. And we could do a whole seminar just on that topic because it's such a rich and important topic. So there's a local cultural element to it and political element, and then there's a cross-border element to it depending on what commodity or mechanism is being exploited for the corruption. I know that's not a very concrete answer to the question. It's the best I could do to talk about why it's endemic. Shared responsibility, shared resources, finding sources of power based on inclusion rather than exclusion is, I think, a fundamental principle.
Tissa, I will direct the next question to you. You mentioned it briefly in your presentation. The international organization in their political strategies face the challenge of reconciling democracy and security. Under the current geopolitical situation, what will be the best way to achieve such a reconciliation? And in connection to this, there is a question in the box for you where the person says, may I ask Intissa? I will say yes. How do you see regional dynamics on the current political controversy in Libya? So if you can put both questions together, please.
Putting both questions together. I mean, the first question is a very difficult one. I truly, I don't think there are any ready answers to that. On the second question, I think really Jonathan answered it best earlier. You know, by the way, Jonathan, if I can just plug the recent piece that you wrote for us on the current developments in Libya, the sort of the emergence again of the potentially two competing governments. And I think what's really interesting, you know, of course, yes, there is the role that, you know, regional actors are playing, but I just want to reiterate a point that really resonated with me that Jonathan had made, which is that, you know, this is a point at which maybe we can talk about Libyans sort of driving potentially the process themselves. And I think that's a really interesting way of looking at it. And I don't know if you want to weigh in on that, Jonathan, but I'd be happy to share the piece that you wrote for us on that here in the chat box. I don't know if people will be able to get it, but I can share it here. Sheikh, maybe you can send it to everybody else. Yeah. There is another question that came about gas and maybe the relationship. Yeah, I don't know where it is. I don't know if it was answered here. Do you see equitable and working relations between West Africa and North Africa countries? Is it okay if I answer that, Sheikh? On hydrocarbon and cross-Mediterranean Sea pipeline. I think this is a really interesting thing that is that's been playing out for a while, right? So Morocco has been talking about developing some kind of pipeline from Nigeria all the way to Morocco. I think it'll and potentially on through Europe. I think it's obviously the logistics of that are very, very complicated. I have been a little bit skeptical about whether that's something that could actually work out. I don't know. I don't have any answers as to whether it could, you know, be equitable once it does work out. But I think it's interesting to think about that, particularly in terms of what's happening right now with, you know, Russia and Ukraine dynamics, and whether those might push Europe to seek sort of more access to more African gas. I think that'll be an interesting thing to see. You know, I'm always surprised whenever I see in the news that Morocco and Nigeria have are kind of moving this forward a little bit, because once again, the sheer sort of complicated logistics of it have always kind of held me back from believing that it could work out. But maybe it's interesting. I think it's interesting to think about how that could play out moving forward.
Yeah, I will encourage the panelists to answer to the question, as this session will go to the YouTube. And I believe that our participants will have the opportunity also to go there and look at the answer that you have been writing to them. And there is another question from Jane. Maybe Rida, si vous pouvez y répondre. How is the position in northern Nigeria, Ghana, and Ivory Coast affecting the broader difficulties in the countries to the north of them?
The region is as Mr. White has already mentioned, I think we talk about mobility and migration, circular migration in the area. When we talk about migration, a lot of times people think of people from West Africa automatically goes to Europe, but that's not the case. I think a lot of it happens within those areas. When we look at the characteristics of this northern areas of Nigeria, Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire, Benin, Togo, there are certain lifestyles of certain communities that depend on nomadism and already the les éleveurs, the pastoralists. They move and follow vegetation and follow rain, like we call the transhumance. So they move with their animals, livestock, and that's their lifestyle. With insecurity and what's happening now in this northern parts, and a little bit of context, they move south when it's hot and more in the desert side of the Saharan areas, so that their animals, they can found the vegetation, and that's a main source of livelihood for a lot of communities. So the insecurity affected them because they cannot move as freely as they used to. Because they are either targeted by different criminal armed groups or including jihadists in some cases. There is also this ethnic tensions because the Fulanis, as I mentioned, they are the ones accused and being stigmatized of being affiliated with jihadists in West Africa. Security measures, we are seeing more counterterrorism operations. So people are not being able to move as freely as they used to. There is also some rules, like people cannot use motorcycles, they cannot use cars in some places. So all these factors are having a major impact on the livelihoods of a lot of communities in these areas. So that's the impact that I'm seeing. It's because of the security situation. The states in the area have struggled along with the international community on how to respond to that, how we prevent a situation from becoming a conflict. Because from my experience on talking to these communities, they said, we have lived like this for centuries and the state almost never existed here. But now when they came, now that they came in looking at us saying that we are the problem. So that it's preventing creating the trust that you need between the communities and the state in order to have some sort of social cohesion in the area. So it's briefly like the impact, I think mainly on the livelihoods of those communities is severe, in addition to displacement.
Thank you, Rida. I will jump to the maybe next question. Maybe, I don't know. People say there is no stupid questions. I will just ask the three of you, what will be the major challenges for the stabilization of the Sahel in light of the current geostrategic stakes in the region? I was in a small conference yesterday, that question was seen as stupid, but I don't think it's stupid. I think it's a real question. And that was one of the main question of this session. Can I start with you, Intisa? Can you hear me?
Sorry, 1 second. Sorry, Sheikh, can you just repeat the last thing that you said? I missed that.
I say, what would be the major challenges for the stabilization of the Sahel in light of the current geostrategic stakes in the region?
Yeah, I mean, I think really it's going to be a combination of efforts, right? There is the local efforts and the role of the local actors that Reda has been talking about. There is certainly, you know, how the situation evolves in Libya. And I think also the point that we have kind of been talking about from different sort of ends, which is the question of, can there be some kind of unified regional response, a regional effort to support, you know, various initiatives, and that, to me, I mean, the question there is not so much whether that's something that's going to potentially happen over the next couple of years. I see that not only is not happening, I see, you know, even further complications to that. As I mentioned, the rivalry between Morocco and Algeria playing out in the Maghreb, and potentially impacting also Sahel dynamics as well. So just kind of, you know, reiterating some of the points that I had made in my comments, and that Jonathan and Reda had also brought in through their comments.
Reda, is the AU playing the role it's supposed to play?
They're trying. The problem is, and as I mentioned, and I was involved recently in evaluating one of the key actors from Europe in terms of stabilization in Mali, and he, like I said, talking to the beneficiaries and talking to the stakeholders, and it always comes down to the strategies developed in Europe don't match the strategies for stability in the country. So they're not on the same ground, on the same page. And when I asked the beneficiaries, for example, why do you accept the strategies even if they don't align with yours? They say, well, if we don't accept them, then we're not going to get anything. So it's that dilemma, and I think that's one of the challenges. Is the failure of having common interests and common vision between the donors and the beneficiaries. I think that's one of the main challenges. The other challenge, on domestic level, finding key leaders who you can rely on, who can have a vision to achieve stability. So far, we have not seen that. We thought that we maybe reached that in Mali and Burkina Faso, and we were wrong. And unfortunately, we are going to continue to see the similar. So definitely, there is a need for a new strategy. What is that going to look like for stabilization? We will see after the next 2 days.
Jonathan, may I ask you, if you were in your position where you were before, what would you advise to the US, to the international communities, to try to help resolve this issue of Sahel and Libya?
Well, first on Libya, I would say live by, I'd be meeting with each representatives of each of the countries that have been involved in Libya. Meet your obligations to Libya under UN Security Council resolutions. Do not provide support for militaries, and tell your clients that they need to deal with one another, and that you're going to insist that they deal with one another and work through UN mediated processes, and get everybody lined up in that way. That's the external work. To the Libyans, I would say the same thing. Don't turn to us to solve your problems. You've got to figure it out together. We're happy to help you, but it's got to be solutions that make sense to you, and we're happy to listen to your solutions. We're not going to tell you what to do. We're happy to listen, and to support the ones that make sense to us. So everybody's treated equally, everybody's pushed down a common path, and so you have external unity, and that begins to promote internal working things out. If you're successful in that, Libya can then play a more constructive role in relationship to the Sahel, for which it is a keystone, because so much moves up through it. And as I mentioned before, I would like to see the Libyan government take its resources and establish essentially small model cities in the south, which I think could attract a lot of positive things. They would have their share of problems, everything does, but it would be at least a constructive development. I would like to see I would be also focused on how the African Union could be leveraged more effectively in support of common goals and become more operationally engaged. It has, from my point of view, underperformed often over the years by comparison to what it should be capable of doing. Again, not to meet U.S. objectives particularly, but to meet the objectives of its member states. Of course, there are a lot of them, and that becomes part of the problem. It's not like the OAS in the Americas is always tremendously operational effective to deal with national or regional problems either. So we shouldn't be unfair to the African Union, but we should certainly continue to try and elevate its engagement. Thank you.
Thank you so much to our panelists. I had a teacher who used to tell me that time is money. And I think he's right. Time is life. We are at the end of our sessions. On behalf of the Africa Study Group and on behalf of the Middle East Institute, I would like to thank our panelists for these excellent presentations. I'm grateful to my colleague of the African Study Group and the CIC, National Capital Branch here in Ottawa, who worked tirelessly to make the webinar a success. Please note that this session has been recorded and will be posted on our YouTube page, and certainly on the YouTube page of our partner, the Middle East Institute. We have other questions that we were unfortunately not able to discuss, but we hope to have another opportunity to continue this debate, which seems rather endless and very important. The next Africa Study Group webinar is set for March 30th and will be dedicated to the issue of unconstitutional power changes and the tremendous efforts made by African institutions to remedy them. I hope we will be able to have a positive discussion. That's all for today. I wish you good day, good health, and depending on where you are, good day, good afternoon, and good night. Merci et à la prochaine. Bye.
Merci. Thank you.